I look back now and realize that there were many ways at some of the best moments of my life, I was miserable. I was not happy. I was stressed.
He won 4 Emmys for playing the same character. A Golden Globe sits on his shelf. For 4 straight years, Forbes named him the highest-paid actor on American television, a number so large it turned a shy theater kid from Houston into one of the wealthiest men in his profession. By every visible measure, Jim Parsons had already won. So why did he just sit down for a podcast interview and say, plainly, that he was miserable through most of it? Not stressed for a season, not tired during a rough stretch of filming, miserable, by his own word, during the exact years the rest of the world assumed were the best of his life. He said there's no amount of money that would make him live through that version of himself again. And the strange part is that the sitcom itself was never really the story. It was the surface. Underneath, it was a much older wound, one that started shaping him years before anyone had ever heard the name Sheldon Cooper. In July of 2026, Jim appeared on the podcast All Out with John Dean and said something in plainer language than he'd ever used before. Looking back at what should have been the peak of his career, he admitted he could now see how unhappy he actually was. I look back now and realize that there were many ways, at some of the best moments of my life. I was miserable, he told Dean. I was not happy. I was stressed. He described the feeling as juggling far too many plates in the air at once, convinced that the good things happening to him only existed because he refused to stop overworking. From the outside, that kind of intensity reads as discipline, as the mark of a serious actor who takes his craft seriously. Jim now describes it differently. He's called it a kind of self-torture, a compulsion built on the belief that nothing good could simply be allowed to happen to him without him controlling every variable first. The conversation mattered for another reason, too. John Dean is also openly gay, and much of the episode became a conversation between two men comparing what it costs to build a public life while managing a private one. Jim didn't shy away from any of it. Even after 12 seasons of playing one of the most recognizable characters on American television, he said the pressure never actually eased. The overworking, the constant bracing for failure, cost him real time. He suggested time with people he loved that he wasn't fully present for because part of his mind was always somewhere else, tallying risk. What makes the admission land differently than a typical celebrity confession is the gap between when it happened and when he finally said it out loud. Big Bang Theory ended in 2019. Jim didn't sit down and describe this level of internal unraveling until the middle of 2026, 7 years after the cameras stopped rolling and long after the show had already been recut into syndication reruns and streaming marathons for a new generation of fans who never watched it live. That's not the timeline of someone processing something quickly. That's the timeline of someone who needed years of distance, a pandemic, a decade's worth of therapy or reflection or simple aging, before he had the language, or maybe just the permission, to describe what had actually been happening underneath the performance the whole time. It's worth pausing on that admission, because it raises an obvious question. What does it do to a person to spend over a decade quietly convinced that the ground could give way at any moment, even while every outside signal says the opposite? To understand where that particular fear came from, you have to go back to 2001, long before Sheldon Cooper existed, to the year that changed how Jim thought about time for the rest of his life. On April 29, 2001, Jim's father, Milton Mickey Parsons Jr., died in a car accident. He was 52 years old. Jim was 28, still years away from booking Big Bang Theory, still working his way through off-Broadway stages and guest spots on shows like Judging Amy and Ed. His father had run a plumbing company in the Houston suburbs, and by most accounts, the crash was sudden and solitary. Jim wouldn't land a role that made him famous for another 6 years, which means his father never saw any of it. Not the Emmys, not the Golden Globe, not a single second of the show that would eventually make his son's face recognizable across the world. That fact sat quietly for years. Then, in the summer of 2018, with Big Bang Theory still one of the most watched shows on television, it stopped being quiet. Jim turned 46 that year, which meant he had reached the exact age, 6 years short of 52, that his father would have been when he died. He's since described doing the math almost involuntarily. My dad had passed years before, But he was 52, he explained later. And I realized that at the end of season 12, I would be 46. I'm not superstitious or anything like that. It was just a context thing. But the context landed hard. He asked himself the kind of question most people spend their whole lives avoiding. If he had 6 years left, would he spend another one of them playing the same character? His answer was no. Not because he'd stopped caring about the role, but because he needed to find out what else existed before his own clock ran out. He took that reasoning directly to the show's creator, Chuck Lorre, and executive producer Steve Molaro, telling them plainly, "If you told me that, like my father, I had 6 years left to live, I think there's other things I need to try and do." The decision to end the show at season 12 was his. His castmates didn't see it coming. Several have said since that the news landed as a genuine shock, not because the show couldn't have continued, but because after over a decade side by side, they hadn't been part of the conversation until the decision was already close to final. It's a strange kind of loneliness, making a decision that reshapes 12 years of other people's lives based on a private grief they never fully knew you were carrying. Years before that decision, Jim had already tried, in his own way, to make peace with exactly how his father died. On an episode of Hollywood Medium with Tyler Henry, he sat down for a reading that turned, almost immediately, to his father's crash back in 2001. Henry told him he was picking up a message insisting that no faster medical response that day could have changed anything, that whatever happened, happened quickly. Jim seemed to find real comfort in hearing that. The important thing is to know it was quick, and that there was nothing that getting there for anybody could have done, he said afterward. It's a small moment, easy to overlook in a list of talk show appearances, but it says something about how long this particular loss had been sitting unresolved in the back of his mind, resurfacing on camera nearly 2 decades after it happened, well before he ever said a word publicly about being miserable during his own biggest years of success. The reasoning behind Jim's exit didn't arrive in one clean moment of clarity. It came out of what he's called a genuinely brutal stretch, the summer between the show's 11th and 12th seasons. He'd flown almost immediately from wrapping season 11 into rehearsals for his Broadway run in The Boys in the Band, splitting his time between a demanding stage schedule and commercial shoots on his days off. At the same time, his and Todd's dog, then 14 years old, was nearing the end of his life. Jim has talked about the exact moment that still upsets him to recall, walking the dog around the block one last time before rushing off to a shoot, watching him struggle and breaking down because he couldn't be present for something that mattered so much. He and Todd ultimately made the decision to let their dog go at home, rather than have him die somewhere unfamiliar while Jim was away working. Just days later, taking a curtain call on the Broadway stage, Jim slipped and broke his foot. He's described that stretch as the scariest few days of his life, saying it felt like standing at the edge of something dark and looking down into it. It was the broken foot, oddly enough, that finally forced him to stop moving long enough to sit with everything else he'd been avoiding, including the math about his father's age that had been quietly running in the back of his mind for months. All of this happened while millions of people were watching Sheldon Cooper crack jokes about comic books and germs every week, with absolutely no idea what the actor underneath him was carrying that same summer. There's something worth sitting with in that gap, the distance between what a performer shows an audience and what's actually happening in the hours before and after the cameras roll. It also says something that the 2 hardest personal losses of that stretch, the dog and the broken foot, didn't happen during some quiet off-season. They happened in the middle of an already overloaded schedule, one where Jim was shuttling between 2 major professional commitments with almost no room left over for anything else, let alone grief. There was no pause button available to him. The show still needed him on set. The play still needed him on stage. And the version of Jim that had spent years training himself to keep every plate spinning simply kept going, because stopping wasn't something he'd built into how he operated. That, in a strange way, is the clearest possible illustration of exactly the pattern he now says he regrets. Even while his body and his heart were both telling him to slow down, the instinct to push through won out, right up until a broken bone physically forced the issue for him. And this wasn't a passing bout of stage fright either. Long after Big Bang Theory ended, on Broadway stages performing live in front of audiences, Jim has said the fear of blanking on his lines never fully left him. By his own description, he remained, even years into a wildly successful career, one of the most nervous people in almost any room he worked in. None of this fear started with fame. Long before anyone in Hollywood knew who Jim Parsons was, he had already spent years perfecting the exact same skill, hiding something real behind a controlled, capable performance. Jim grew up in a Houston suburb, the son of a plumbing company president and a schoolteacher. He was in school plays from the time he was a small child all the way through high school, a pull toward acting that never really left him. Even during the 1 year he tried to walk away from it entirely and go back to finish a business degree instead, convinced the acting path was too impractical to bet his future on. It was watching friends rehearse, along with encouragement from Todd Spiewak, then his boyfriend, that pulled him back toward the stage. The two of them eventually moved out to pursue theater seriously, and Jim went on to earn a master's degree in classical acting at the University of San Diego's Old Globe program. But underneath the ambition was a much older, quieter fear that had nothing to do with career risk. Jim has said he spent years terrified of being found out as gay, a fear that didn't fade with adulthood and didn't fade even after he moved to New York to chase acting work seriously. He's described avoiding entire neighborhoods known for being gay-friendly, not because he didn't want to belong there, but because he was afraid of being noticed, of standing out in a way that could be used against him. Even the sight of a pride parade, he said, used to make him uneasy, simply because he knew how many people around him held hostile views about exactly who he was. He and Todd, who met on a blind date in 2002, were together for roughly a decade before the world knew anything about their relationship. That changed in May of 2012, when a New York Times profile tied to Jim's Broadway run in The Normal Heart quietly confirmed that he was gay and in a 10-year relationship without naming Todd directly. It wasn't a splashy announcement. It was a single line inside a larger piece about his career, and it was enough to end over a decade of careful silence. Jim has said the fear leading up to that moment was real. He worried it could cost him the show, at a time when very few leading men on major network sitcoms had ever come out publicly, let alone one playing a character adored by a broad, not particularly progressive, mainstream audience. Instead, the opposite happened. He said that becoming visibly part of a community that still faces real hostility gave him a strength he hadn't expected, and if anything, it helped rather than hurt his career. What makes the timing notable is how quiet it actually was. There was no press conference, no carefully staged sit-down interview built around the announcement. It arrived almost as a footnote inside a piece about a Broadway revival, a single sentence that confirmed what plenty of people had already suspected without ever forcing Jim to define himself by it. He since said he never fully understood being framed publicly, in various interviews over the years, as some kind of symbol or statement. To him, the relationship with Todd was never activism. It was simply his life, built slowly and privately over a decade, finally allowed to exist in the open. He and Todd married in May of 2017, at New York's Rainbow Room, after roughly 15 years together, and Jim has described their life since as almost deliberately unremarkable, full of the same small routines as any other marriage. But even after building a full, honest life with the person he loved, Jim still couldn't outrun the thing that had shaped him since he was 28 years old. The fear of losing everything the moment he let his guard down didn't disappear just because he'd survived coming out. It simply found new places to live. Every reflection Jim has offered in 2026 keeps circling back to the same idea: time, and how much of it he spent treating success as something that had to be defended rather than enjoyed. He said plainly that no amount of money could get him to return to the version of himself that existed during Big Bang Theory's biggest years, the version constantly overworking, constantly bracing for the other shoe to drop. He's called it a self-tortured stretch of his life, one he considers valuable in hindsight, but not something he would ever choose to relive. That's a strange thing to hear from someone who reached the exact kind of success most working actors never get close to. 4 Emmys for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Comedy Series, a Golden Globe, a Tony nomination years later for the play Mother Play, along with acclaimed runs in Thornton Wilder's Our Town, and earlier Broadway credits including Harvey, An Act of God, The Normal Heart, and The Boys in the Band, a role he later reprised on screen. What's easy to forget now is how close he came to never getting any of it. Before Big Bang Theory, Jim auditioned for roughly 30 different roles, watching pilot after pilot die on the network's desk even after he'd already booked the part. He tried out for the American version of The Office around the same era, a role that never worked out, and he since admitted he privately thought the entire concept sounded like a bad idea. A British import American audiences surely wouldn't take to. He was wrong about that one, spectacularly. When Sheldon Cooper's audition script eventually came his way, something about it pulled at him immediately, enough that he skipped a party the night before just to keep working the lines. His first read for producer Chuck Lorre reportedly went so well that Lorre assumed it had to be beginner's luck, bringing Jim back for a second audition just to be sure. It wasn't luck. There's a small irony sitting underneath all of it, too. The actor who spent 12 years playing television's most famous fictional physicist actually failed science as a student, a fact he's chalked up to only ever wanting to study meteorology because he grew up in hurricane country, not because the subject itself interested him. Years of directing and executive producing on the spin-off Young Sheldon followed, a project that started, almost by accident, as a conversation between Jim and Todd about Jim's own nephew, a sharp, unusual kid who reminded Jim of a young version of the character he played. He eventually pitched the idea to Chuck Lorre without expecting much to come of it. Between 2015 and 2018, Forbes named Jim the highest-paid actor on American television for 4 consecutive years, a fact that makes his earlier decade of rejected pilots almost unrecognizable in hindsight. Even with the director's credit to his name by that point, Jim has said he still fundamentally thinks of himself as a performer, someone who feels more at home in front of the camera than behind it. There's a particular kind of pressure that comes with being the reason a show works. Sheldon Cooper wasn't written as an easy character to sustain across 279 episodes. He required a level of precision that couldn't slip for even one scene, a rhythm of speech and physicality that had to feel effortless on screen while demanding total control behind it. People who worked alongside Jim for over a decade have described him showing up with stacks of index cards, memorizing every line before table reads even started, treating each week's episode less like routine television and more like a role that had to be re-earned from scratch every single time. That kind of preparation doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't come free. It's the same instinct he now describes as compulsive, the same need for control that made the show brilliant and, by his own account, made him miserable while he was doing it. On paper, all of this looks like a man who has everything anyone in his profession could want. In his own words, some of his best years were spent quietly falling apart while everyone around him assumed he was simply thriving. At this year's Tony Awards, Jim showed up without any of the polished, high-gloss looks people associate with his current Broadway run in Titanique, and admitted something almost nobody expected to hear from him. He said he sometimes worries that fans who remember him as Sheldon will be disappointed by how much he's aged since the show ended. He started playing the role at 34. He's 53 now, 1 year older than his own father ever got to be. When that fact was pointed out to him directly on a podcast, Jim didn't deflect it. He called it bonus time, not as a throwaway line, but as something closer to an actual belief he's built the rest of his life around. In an odd, almost cruel coincidence, that same July, right as this unusually honest interview was spreading online, a fabricated report claiming Jim had died began circulating on social media. A page mourning his supposed passing gathered close to 1 million reactions before his representatives had to step in and confirm, plainly, that he was alive and well. For a few strange days, people online were genuinely mourning a man who, at that exact moment, was quietly telling the world something closer to the opposite. That he finally understood how limited and precious his actual time was, and that he intended to use whatever was left of it differently than before. He said he no longer feels like he has anything left to prove professionally, that at this point he only wants to take on work that brings him some real joy, because he's fully aware that nobody, no matter how successful, actually knows how much time they have left. Even now, decades into performing, he's admitted he still walks into every single show fighting the same old fear of blanking in front of a live audience, a nervousness that apparently never fully disappears, no matter how experienced a person becomes. And he's been clear about one more thing. No matter what anyone offers him, he has no interest in ever putting Sheldon Cooper's cardigan back on for a reboot or a revival. That chapter for him is closed. It's worth noting what he chose instead. Titanique isn't a prestige drama built to win him another award, and it isn't a quiet passion project tucked away from public view either. It's a loud, campy, deliberately ridiculous stage parody. 8 shows a week, night after night, in a role that has nothing to do with rebuilding a legacy or proving he can still carry a franchise. By most accounts, it's simply the kind of work that makes him laugh. After a career spent white-knuckling his way through 12 seasons of a show he now admits he was privately unraveling inside of, choosing something built purely around joy, rather than status or box office weight, reads less like a step down and more like a deliberate correction. It's the kind of choice a person makes only after finally admitting to themselves what the last version of success actually cost them. That shift in priorities didn't happen overnight, and it clearly didn't happen easily. Jim has spent the better part of this year talking about it in increasing detail, across multiple interviews, each one peeling back a little more than the last. That's not usually how people discuss something they've fully resolved. It's closer to how people talk when they're still actively working through it in real time, testing out language in public before they've entirely settled on how to feel about their own past. The single fact that shaped him at 28, the one that pushed him off Big Bang Theory at 46, the one that sat beside him through a devastating summer of loss in his final season, is still, by his own account, the quiet engine behind almost everything he does at 53. The tragedy here was never really about the sitcom ending, or the awards, or the paycheck. It was about a man spending decades treating his own survival like a countdown clock, right up until he finally decided to stop running from it and start actually living inside the time he has left. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If you knew exactly how much time you had left, would you still be living the way you are right now? If you enjoyed this deep dive, smash that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories. Hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching.